Okay, good evening. It is time for another chapter from the Hiram Key. So, um, just going to do one chapter tonight, just like I did last time. These chapters are fairly long, so um, we'll get to that. And then there are actually a bunch of pictures. I think I'll maybe go ahead and go through them tonight. Um, yeah, yeah. Well, I'll decide when I get to that point. Anyway, so we're on chapter 10. 1,000 years of struggle. Okay, so the the early Jewish nation. The death of King Solomon occurred almost exactly 1,000 years before the final and most famous claimant to the title King of the Jews died at the hands of the Romans. For the Jews, it was a millennium filled with pain, struggle, and defeat, but never surrender. It was also characterized by a desperate search for a racial identity and a craving for a theology and social framework that was their own. They had the distant legend of a founding father in Abraham and a lawgiver in Moses, but they had little else that amounted to a culture. The early Jewish kings provided a hollow sense of heritage. David, erroneously portrayed as a giant killer, gave them a role model for their expected victory over their powerful neighbors, and Solomon, humble and ill-starred though his exploits had been, became the focus of national pride. It was not a man, however, who eventually came to epitomize the search for purpose and self-esteem. It was a small and unimportant building that Solomon had erected for the god of war, Yahweh. As we have seen, after the death of Solomon, the two lands of the Jews split apart again, with Israel in the north and Judah in the south. They returned to their own respective views of development, which quite soon led to war against each other. In the other kingdom, I'm sorry, in the northern kingdom, assassination of the king became almost a national sport, and in the centuries that followed, war, murder, and treachery became the norm. Perhaps the most infamous individual of this period was Jehu, or Jehu, Jehu, a general who came to a general who came to power by personally murdering Jehoram, king of Israel. He then murdered Ahaziah of Judah, who was unfortunate enough to be visiting the north, and had the unfortunate Jezebel trampled to pieces beneath the hooves of horses, so that only her skull, feet, and the palms of her hands were found for burial. A further 112 possible opponents were killed, and all the Baal worshippers in the land were rounded up and slaughtered. We are told that God was well pleased with these noble actions, saying in 2 Kings 10:30, quote, "And the Lord said unto Jehu, Because thou hast done well in executing that which is right in mine eyes, and hast done unto the house of Ahab according to all that was in mine heart, thy children of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel." End quote. The southern kingdom of Judah continued to be ruled from Jerusalem, and the contrast with Israel in the north could not have been greater. Judah managed to maintain genuine stability for almost 3.5 centuries after the split. The Davidic line continued uninterrupted for over 400 years in total, which contrasts strongly with Israel's 8 revolutionary dynastic changes in its first 2 centuries alone. The question that we had to ask ourselves was, why did the two halves of the briefly constituted state fare so differently? Geography may have something to do with it. Judah, the southern kingdom, was off the main east-west route, and the terrain was more difficult for foreign invaders, giving it a greater sense of national security than the northern kingdom could ever hope to enjoy. We strongly suspected, however, that the main reason for the coincidence of the Davidic royal line over such a considerable I'm sorry, I said coincidence. Let me start that again. That was totally misread. We strongly suspected, however, that the main reason for the continuance of the Davidic royal line over such a considerable period was due to the cohesion provided by a divine right to rule, quote unquote, conferred by a mystic and secret ceremony. Just as the early Egyptian kings had been viewed as placed in power by the gods, so the descendants of David were considered to be Yahweh's choice, and the all important covenant between the God and his people was the continuity of kingship. We felt that if our suppositions were right, the ruling family and its entourage would have been united by their membership of the secret holding group, the Lodge, and when they raised their chosen candidate to the status of king, insurrection was very unlikely because of the power of this controlling group. The central importance of the king of Judah was demonstrated in their New Year's rituals, which followed Egyptian and Babylonian models. Some of the most important ritual acts were intended to ensure that the king continued to rule, an example of this being a reenactment by the king of the original battle of the triumph of the forces of light over the forces of darkness and chaos. The king and his priests chanted the Enuma Elish, the story that tells how the chaos dragon Tiamat was overcome to allow the creation to take place. This ritual can be compared to the Egyptian hippopotamus ritual discussed in chapter 8, which reaffirmed the king's ancient and sacred right to rule. The king's role as holder of the covenant gave him responsibility for the well-being of his people, and any catastrophe on a national scale would be attributed to the fact that the king had either overstepped the mark or allowed his subjects to offend Yahweh in some way. The exile in Babylon. The northern kingdom of Israel had struggled from start to finish, and it finally collapsed in 721 BC when it was overrun by the Assyrians. Judah lasted over a century and a half longer. On 15 and 16 March 597 BC, the great Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar seized Jerusalem, captured the king, and appointed a new puppet king called Zedekiah. The true king, oh wow, Jehoiachin. I don't know. I don't know these names. I don't know how to pronounce them. Sorry. Um, the true king Jehoiachin was carried into exile with all his court and the intellectuals of the land. The idea being that those that remained would not have the wit to raise a rebellion against their new masters. The Bible gives us various numbers, but it is probable that over 3,000 people were taken to Babylon. Cuneiform tablets found at Babylon list payments of rations of oil and grain to the captives, naming specifically King Jehoiachin and his 5 sons as recipients. The fact that Jehoiachin had not been put to death made many Jews believe that he would be allowed to return, and there is evidence that this may well have been Nebuchadnezzar's original intention. The new puppet king was not as docile as the Babylonians imagined, and he was tempted to side with Babylon's enemies, the Egyptians, in order to liberate Judah. At first he followed the advice of his supporters and caused his masters no difficulty. Unfortunately, pro-Egyptian pressures in his court forced a rebellion in 589 BC, which immediately prompted Nebuchadnezzar to attack the cities of Judah. Oh, and we're in an ad. So, we'll hold off there. Hey, Vesper! Okay, so we're about 15 seconds from the end of the ad. We'll get back to it. And it says we're back. Okay. So, hey Vesper, how's it going? Good to see you. Welcome in. You haven't missed much if you just got here. Um, so let me back up just a sentence or so here. Let's see. Unfortunately, pro-Egyptian pressures in his court forced a rebellion in 589 BC, which immediately prompted Nebuchadnezzar to attack the cities of Judah. In the following January, the siege of Jerusalem began. Zedekiah knew that there would be no mercy this time, and he held out for 2.5 years. But despite an attempt by Egyptian forces to drive off the Babylonians, the city fell in July 586 BC. Jerusalem and its temple were utterly destroyed. Stomach's bothering you, so you thought you'd relax tonight. Well, thank you for coming in here to do your relaxing. Sorry to hear you're not feeling good. Hopefully it's something just transient. Zedekiah was brought before Nebuchadnezzar in Riblah, in Babylonia, where he was forced to watch the killing of his sons, and as he stared in horror, his eyes were plucked out. With this last terrible sight burned into his memory, the puppet king was carried off to Babylon in chains. According to Jeremiah chapter 52, verse 29, a further 832 people were taken in exile at the same time. For the exiles from Judah, Babylon must have been a marvelous place to behold. It was a cosmopolitan and splendid city that spanned both banks of the Euphrates in the form of a square said to measure 15 miles by 15 miles. The Greek historian Herodotus visited the city in the 5th century BC and described its grand scale, with its grid work of perfectly straight roads and buildings that were mostly 3 or even 4 stories high. Our first reaction to this description was to assume that this Greek was guilty of exaggeration, but we then discovered that he had also claimed that the city walls were so wide that a chariot with 4 horses could be driven along them, and recent excavations have shown this to be completely true. This archaeological support for the standing of Herodotus as a reliable witness caused us to appreciate just how impressive Babylon must have been. We read that inside the gigantic city walls lay expansive parks, and amongst its great buildings was the king's palace with its famous hanging gardens, which were huge artificial mountain terraces covered in trees and awash with flowers brought from all around the known world. There was also the lofty ziggurat of Bel, the stepped pyramid with 7 tower-like stories, faced with the colors of the sun, moon, and 5 planets, and upon its summit a temple. This wonderful structure was no doubt the source of inspiration for the story of the Tower of Babel, where mankind was said to have lost the ability to communicate in a single language. Babel was a Sumerian term meaning God Gate, providing the Babylonian priesthood with a link between the gods and earth. Amazingly, the Tower of Babel still exists, although it is now just a shapeless ruin. The processional way which led to the great Ishtar Gate must have caused the eyes of the arriving exiles to widen. It was massive in scale and covered with brilliant blue glazed tiles on which were depicted lions, bulls, and dragons in raised relief. These animals represented the gods of the city, Marduk, the dragon deity, being foremost among them, along with Adad, the god of the sky in the form of a bull, and Ishtar herself, the goddess of love and war, symbolized by a lion. For the deported for the deported priests and nobles of Jerusalem, this new existence must have been very strange. They must have felt gratitude that they had not been put to the sword and sorrow for the loss of their land and temple. Yet they must have been impressed by what they saw and heard. In the greatest city of Mesopotamia, a metropolis that must have made Jerusalem and its temple look extremely humble. It must have been the kind of culture shock that the immigrant Jews from small European towns felt as they sailed into New York in the early part of the 20th century. The whole way of life in Babylonia would have been alien, but they soon found that the theology was surprisingly familiar. Their own Egyptian/Canaanite-based legends and those of the Babylonians derived from a common ancient Sumerian source, and the Jews soon found that the gaps in their own tribal stories of the creation and the flood could now be filled in. The dignitaries who had been uprooted had been used to running a kingdom, and now they had found themselves dispersed around an alien land, usually with only very menial tasks required of them. For men used to running a state, they now had little to do but reflect upon the injustice of life. Nevertheless, the vast majority of them simply accepted that life was cruel and got on with making the best of a bad situation. Indeed, a significant number, maybe even the majority, of Jewish families became wholly absorbed into the fabric of life in the big city, and stayed on when the captivity ended. Contrary to popular belief, the Jews of this period were not monotheistic, and even if they did hold Yahweh to be the special God of their nation, they would have worshipped Babylonian gods upon enforced arrival in their new home. Then it was quite normal to show respect to the god or gods of an area one visited as a matter of prudence, because all deities were thought to be territorial in their power. Yahweh's zone of influence lay in Jerusalem, and from all of the evidence available, it seems that even his strongest supporters never created a shrine to him in the entire period of their captivity. Whilst most of these Jews got on with life as it came to them, a small number of the deportees were philosophical and fundamentalist priests from Solomon's temple, who can only be described as inspired people with a thwarted sense of destiny, and they sought to rationalize the situation as best they could. It is now generally accepted that it was here during the Babylonian captivity that most of the first 5 books of the Bible were written down in a passionate search for purpose and heritage. Using information about the beginning of time from their captors, the Jews were able to reconstruct the way that God had created the world and mankind, as well as gain details about later events such as the flood. The writings of these first Jews were a mixture of snippets of accurate historical fact, chunks of corrupted cultural memories, and tribal myths, cemented together by their own original inventions generated wherever awkward gaps appeared in their history. It is obviously very difficult to separate which bits are which, but modern scholars have become remarkably able to in identifying probable truths and fictions, as well as breaking down authorship styles and influences. The broad stories have been analyzed in depth by teams of experts, but for us, it is the small pieces of oddball information that often provide some of the most powerful clues to origins. We found that the influence of both Sumer and Egypt in unexpected places. For instance, the figure of Jacob, the father of Joseph, should predate Egyptian influence, yet there are clear signs that those who wrote about him were themselves viewing the world long after the Exodus out of Egypt. In Genesis 28:18, we are told that Jacob erected a pillar to link earth with heaven at Bethel, some 10 miles north of Jerusalem, and later in Genesis 31:45, he created a second, possibly at Mizpah, which was in the mountains of Gilead, east of the river Jordan. This identification of 2 pillars is strongly reminiscent of the theology that Moses had brought with him from the twin kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt. It is unlikely that either of the towns identified in the Bible existed in Jacob's time, and when one looks at the literal meanings of the names of these towns, it is clear that they were created to meet the requirements of the story. Bethel means God's house, suggesting a point of contact between the heavens and earth, and Mizpah means watchtower, which is a point of protection from invasion. Most Westerners today think of names as abstract labels, and when a baby is expected, parents can buy a book of names from which to pick one they fancy. For most of history, though, instead of being merely a pleasant or popular designation, names have conveyed important meanings. It is very significant to note that the late Semitic philologist John Allegro discovered that the name Jacob stems directly from the Sumerian Ya'agub. That's IA-A-Gub, meaning pillar, or more literally, standing stone. When writing down the history of their people, the Hebrews gave the key characters titles to communicate specific meanings, which modern readers see simply as personal names. We believe that the authors of Genesis conveyed a great deal in calling their character Jacob, and when the script changes his name to Israel, this signaled to the contemporary reader that the pillars of the new kingdom were in place and that the nation was ready to be given its own name. This was a necessary precursor to the establishment of true kingship. The prophet of the New Jerusalem. One of the strangest and yet most important figures in our reconstruction of the Babylonian exile was the prophet Ezekiel. His brooding, repetitive, and often difficult writing style has caused many observers to conclude that this man must have been quite mad. Whether or not he existed, and whether he was sane or totally schizophrenic, does not really matter because the writings attributed to him, false or otherwise, provided the theology of Qumran. The people who were the Jerusalem church. Ezekiel was the architect of the imaginary or idealized temple of Yahweh, and we would argue that it was the most important of them all. Many 20th century experts have concluded that these works were the output of several much later people, circa 230 BC onwards. This would place it close to the dating as This would place it close to the dating as the oldest Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran, though thought to date from around 187 BC to AD 70. If this is the case, it would affect our thesis, serving only to confirm the already massive links between these writings and the Qumran community. So for convenience, we have assumed at this stage that the book of Ezekiel was indeed written by one man whilst in captivity in Babylon. The fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple were of massive significance to Ezekiel, who was a priest at the temple and one of the elite taken into exile in 597 BC. The weird visions that he had whilst in captivity are centered around these events. His wife died on the eve of the destruction of the temple, which for the prophet was a sign of great portent. However, the disaster in no way surprised Ezekiel, who saw it as Yahweh's punishment for Israel's wicked and unworthy history stemming back to its pagan origins and the worshipping of Egyptian idols. The infidelity to Yahweh had continued right up to the time when God allowed Israel's enemies to smite her. Despite all that Yahweh had done for his chosen people, Israel, the two kingdoms, had persisted in behaving in a rebellious, brazen, and callous way, unmindful of her holy calling and covenantal bond. The Jews had disobeyed the divine laws and statutes and profaned holy things, including the temple itself. the temple where his glory dwelt in the Holy of Holies. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple represented a death, whilst the expected new city and the rebuilt temple would be a resurrection, a rebirth with the stain of guilt removed. Ezekiel saw himself as the architect of the new temple, one that would fulfill the promise and create a centerpiece for the nation that would be so pure and good it would be the kingdom of heaven upon earth. In his visions, obscure allegory and symbolism abound with images of multi-faced men, lions, eagles, and such odd items as iron baking plates. He flies through the air back to the temple and undergoes strange rituals such as shaving off his hair and beard, dividing it into 3 parts by weighing it. 1/3 of his hair and whiskers is burned, another cut to pieces by a sword, and the last third is scattered to the winds. At this time, a person's hair represented their dignity, their strength, and their power, and it seems to us that this imagery must have been representational of the recent fate of the people of Judah and Israel. A particularly interesting and important vision occurred in November 591 BC when Ezekiel was sitting in his house near the Grand Canal in the city of Nippur in Mesopotamia, Sumer, with the visiting elders of Judah sitting in front of him. The elders, perhaps including the ex-king himself, had come to hear of any messages from Yahweh when the prophet fell into a trance and saw a man clothed in fire and light, who put forth his hand, seized him by the forelock, and transported him back to the inner gate of the temple. Ezekiel saw images of pagan worship to the gods Tammuz, Baal, and Adonis before being taken to a door of the court and commanded to dig a hole in the wall through which he saw a remarkable sight. Quote, through it he sees mural paintings containing pictures of creeping things and other mythological scenes, motifs which seem to point to syncretistic practices of Egyptian provenance. 70 elders are engaged in secret mysteries with censers in their hands, end quote. And that is from Peake's Commentary on the Bible, by the way. The bold letters are ours because, they put Egyptian and secret mysteries in bold letters. The bold letters are ours because here we have the elders of Jerusalem, the very people sitting in front of the entranced Ezekiel, accused of possessing secret mysteries of Egyptian origin and conducting private ceremonies in the Temple of Solomon. Ezekiel 8:12 tells that the ceremony was conducted in the dark, as is the modern Masonic third degree. What could the prophet have been referring to? This part of the vision has never made much sense to biblical scholars, beyond the general and obvious message that the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem was believed to be due to a lack of a pure relationship with Yahweh. The Egyptian element has never been explained, especially as it is clear from the vision that it was the elders themselves involved in these secret rites. The verse, Ezekiel 8:8, that introduces this particular vision tells of how the prophet was able to spy on the proceedings and has some remarkable similarities to Genesis 49:6, which earlier we identified as referring to the failed plot of Joseph's to get the secrets of Sekenenre and the fact that the villains, quote, digged down a wall, end quote. You will recall that the verse in Genesis said, quote, O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly, mine honor be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall, end quote. The verse in Ezekiel appears to build directly on the circumstances of the failed attempt to get the secrets of king-making from Sekenenre Dao. It reads, quote, Then he said to me, Son of man, dig now in the wall. And when I had digged in the wall, behold, a door. End quote. In Genesis, there was a failure to gain the original secrets, but in Ezekiel's vision, he found a door and saw what was going on. But this time, it was not in a temple at Thebes, but with the original secrets, but in the temple at Jerusalem with the substituted secrets. Ezekiel is outraged by the Egyptianesque images on the walls, naming the principal culprit as King Josiah, who in the middle of the previous century had had the temple repaired and the walls redecorated. The description sounds remarkably similar to the symbolism found on the walls and ceiling of a modern Masonic temple, which was based on King Solomon's temple, and even today most of the devices are undeniably Egyptian. The ex-leaders of the kingdom of Judah who huddled in Ezekiel's house in exile in Nippur were there for guidance from the holy man, and he gave it. As we read and reread Ezekiel, we could not believe how much. Sorry, I've got to skip past all those pictures I mentioned earlier. We could not believe how much sense this obscure book now made. Our excitement mounted as it became clear that we had found a major link in our reconstructed chain of events, linking Seconenre to the Qumran community. The message that the prophet was putting to the exiled elders concerned their own secret ceremony that had come down to them through the line of David from Moses. The essence of the prophet's message was something like this, quote, I tell you that we have lost our kingdom through people being unfaithful to Yahweh, worshiping other gods, and you were the greatest transgressors because you have conducted your secret mysteries, which are from pagan Egypt, based on sun worship and without a role for the God of our fathers. You are the greatest sinners of them all, and it is right that Yahweh has punished you. End quote. We could imagine the responses of these broken men. They're imagined quotes, but they're still quotes. So, quote, but those are the secrets given to the royal house of David by Moses himself, end quote. Quote, and because of it you no longer have a royal house. Remember, Yahweh is the heavenly king, replies Ezekiel. What should we do, prophet? Tell us how to regain what we have lost. You must rebuild the temple of your hearts first, and the temple of stone will follow. Live according to the law and worship Yahweh alone. You may keep your secrets, but you must do away with the Egyptian story and turn the great truths within it to your task of rebuilding the temple. Know your secrets, but know your God first. End quote. We can think of no clearer or more simple explanation for this important vision of Ezekiel's. We believe it was at this point in the history of the Jewish people that the story of Seconenre became the story of Hiram, the builder of the first temple that was lost because of the reforming urge of Ezekiel to remove as many traces of Egyptian ritual as he could. The book of Ezekiel goes on to tell how he was commanded in another vision to take two staffs, inscribe them with the names Judah and Joseph, and join them into one, symbolically reuniting the two kingdoms. One king will rule over them, and Yahweh will save her from apostasy, sliding back into having relationships with other gods. Purify her from all cleanliness and bring her into a new covenant relationship. Under the rule of his servant David, she will live in obedience and faithfulness and occupy the land of the fathers. The covenant of peace, like all the blessings and benefits of the new age, will be everlasting, but above all Yahweh will dwell in the midst of his people. The presence of his sanctuary in their midst is a pledge that the covenant has been renewed, and therefore the nations will see that Yahweh has sanctified his people and has thereby set them apart. Okay, I just want to see how far we have. Okay, not a whole lot farther. 8 pages. The most famous of Ezekiel's visions was one that occurred early in 573 BC, after the prophet had spent nearly a quarter of a century in captivity, by which time his worldview had become particularly refined. In this vision, he is transported to a high mountain where he can see a panorama of buildings spread out before him with walls and gates like a city. First, he finds himself at the east gate, where he meets a man like a figure of bronze with a 10 feet 4-inch measuring reed in his hand. This is his architectural guide. Ezekiel is told to pay close attention, for it will be his duty to report everything he sees to the exiles. First, he sees the east gate, also known as the Gate of Righteousness, in direct line with the main approach to the temple. The main temple area is elevated so as to separate the holy from the profane, and by ascending 7 steps they arrive at the threshold and then the passageway of the gate, where there are 3 guard rooms facing each other, all of them being a perfect square and of the same dimensions. The echoes of this vision are very clear in Freemasonry, with the importance of the East Gate and the respect for squareness, but of particular significance are the 7 steps to the threshold. The candidate in the 3rd degree ceremony is required to take 7 steps to the Master's pedestal in the east of the Masonic temple. Beyond the passageway is a 2nd threshold and the vestibule of the gate that leads to the court. Along the wall of the outer court, to a depth of the length of the gates, runs a large pavement with symmetrically arranged chambers totaling 30 in all. The degrees of holiness are represented by the increasing elevation of the various parts of the temple. The description of the component parts goes on and identifies the 3 gates as being in the east, west, and south, just as Masonic tradition has it. Eventually, Ezekiel is led to the inner court, where he sees 2 rooms at the side of the north and south gates, the former for the priests who control the temple precincts, and the latter for those who have charge of the altar. The court is a perfect square. The vestibule of the temple is 10 steps higher than the inner court, the pillars of which are identified as corresponding with Boaz and Jachin, I'm not sure, Jachin. I still don't know how to pronounce that one. The pillars of Boaz and Hakin, the pillars of Solomon's temple. The vision culminates with Yahweh's return, and like the Horus king of ancient Egypt, he rises like a star in the east and enters his new house through the gate of righteousness. Finally, the imagination of Ezekiel establishes the rules for the priesthood that would become the landmarks of the Essenes of Qumran. The legitimate priests of the sanctuary are to be the sons of Zadok, the erstwhile chief priest, known to the people of Qumran as Zadokites. These sons of Zadokites, I don't know. Whenever I see it written like that, I don't know. I guess it's Zadokites in this particular case. So I'll read it as such. Known to the people of Qumran as Zadokites, these sons of Zadok would wear white linen garments when they entered the inner court. They could not shave their heads, nor allow their hair to grow very long. They could not drink wine before entering the inner court. They had to marry a virgin of Israelite birth, and they must teach people the difference between clean and unclean. The list of requirements went on and included that they should not have personal possessions, nor come into contact with the dead. The template for the new order had been made, and the image of the temple to be became more important than the temple that had been lost. Zerubbabel's temple. In 12 on 12 October 539 BC, a general of the Persian king Cyrus by the name of Ugbaru took the city of Babylon without bloodshed. 17 days later, Cyrus himself rode up to the Ishtar Gate in his chariot, followed by the combined armies of Persia and Medes. The king not only allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, he returned to them the treasures that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple. The Jews regained their city, but Judah became a province of the Persian instead of the Babylonian Empire. People who had left Jerusalem as children returned as old men and women. Their memories of the city of their birth must have been dim, and the reality of the partly rebuilt community must have come as a shock after a lifetime in Babylonia. It must have been a shock, too, for the population that had remained in Jerusalem throughout, to see thousands of strangers arriving from the east, demanding not only food and shelter, but also expecting to take possession of old family lands and homes. Must have been quite difficult, to say the least. They brought with them ideas that had been incubated in captivity, and these sophisticated relatives soon got down to the business of building a new and powerful covenant with Yahweh. The temple was rebuilt before the end of the 6th century BC by Zerubbabel, the grandson of the last king and the heir to the throne of David. The considerable effect that the captivity had on the Jews is well illustrated by the name of their leader. Zerubbabel means seed of Babylon. As new stones were put one upon the other, so new stricter requirements for holiness were being formulated, not only of priests, but now laymen too. We use the term men deliberately here because, whilst women were still involved in various aspects of the new religion under the Second Temple, they were not allowed to be priests. The book of the law that was enforced by the returning exiles was very precise about what was required of Yahweh's people. Dietary laws were extremely demanding, with long lists of food that could not be eaten. The list of unclean animals was comprehensive and included camels, badgers, crabs, lobsters, shellfish, sharks, snakes, bats, swarming insects, rats, lizards, hares, ostriches, and, of course, pigs. Animals that were considered acceptable for the dinner table ranged from such understandable choices as sheep, goats, doves, and pigeons to what would seem to us to be less tasty morsels such as crickets, locusts, and grasshoppers. It is important to remember that prior to the return of the exiles, the people of Israel and Judah were not generally monotheists, nor fervent followers of Yahweh, the God of Moses. In fact, the term Jew, meaning member of the tribe of Judah, was coined in the Babylonian captivity, and with it came a new and powerful sense of nationhood that was marked by the construction of Zerubbabel's temple. The builders of the New Jerusalem saw themselves as a people with something special in their relationship with Yahweh, and to protect their specialness, they took such steps as banning marriage outside of their own people. In this way, the once disparate tribes of the Levant became a race. The new threat to Yahweh. The Jews, with their new heightened sense of identity, had escaped their Babylonian masters, thanks to the intervention of the Persians, into whose empire they were now absorbed. The influence of both of these great powers is apparent in the writings of the Old Testament, but in the mid-4th century BC, a radically new culture arose that was to have a far more profound effect on the future of Judaism. It not so much influenced as collided with the introverted spiritual outlook of the Jews. These radical thinkers were the Greeks. The Greeks had their own pantheon of gods, but unlike the private and inward-looking Jews, they were cosmopolitan and eclectic, with a keen interest in the gods of other people. The Jews had built a theology that had originally drawn on beliefs from Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, and elsewhere, but now they wanted only consolidation and a focus on their special god, Yahweh. Though the Greeks, on the other hand, were equally superstitious about the role of otherworldly influences, they were open to new ideas. They had created a clearer separation between the role of the gods and man's right to think creatively, believing that their destiny was dependent upon science, politics, finance, and military might. Whilst in Jerusalem, social order was centered around a priesthood and the appeasement of a difficult god. The Greek thinkers were producing a new class of philosophers, scientists, and poets. The world found out about this new great power through the military exploits of one of the greatest leaders ever seen, the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. Alexander led an army that conquered Egypt, the entire Persian Empire, and crossed Afghanistan into the Indian subcontinent. Yet when he died of fever in Babylon in 323 BC, he was still only 33 years old. The empire created by this remarkable young king opened up a truly international way of life, with knowledge as well as goods being exchanged around the world from the new city of Alexandria in Egypt to the Indus Valley. The Greek language became the standard for commerce, diplomacy, and learning. The Hellenistic way of life and way of thinking became the only way for intellectuals. If a person could not read and write in Greek, they were outside the new international elite. The crumbling Egyptian society responded to the arrival of the Greeks by declaring the 24-year-old Alexander to be the son of God and Pharaoh incarnate. The young warrior who rid Egypt of Persian invaders, but who had himself come from across the Mediterranean Sea, took the throne name Ha-Ibre Setep en Amen, which meant jubilant is the heart of Re, chosen of Amen. Alexander's stay in Egypt was short, but his influence was massive, as he restored ancient temples and built the city that still bears his name. The Hellenistic influence in Egypt remained with the line of pharaohs known as Ptolemies, who, despite their traditional royal trappings, were Greeks themselves. The most famous of them was Cleopatra, who was reputed to be wise as well as beautiful. Certainly she was one of the very few leaders of this dynasty who could even speak Egyptian. In the city of Alexandria, old Egyptian gods were merged with Greek gods to produce hybrid deities to suit prevailing tastes. The twin pillars of the two lands became the pillars of Hermes, and the attributes of the ancient Egyptian moon god Thoth became absorbed into Hermes. Thoth represented wisdom and was, you will recall, the mother of Ma'at. It was said that this god possessed all secret knowledge on 36,535 scrolls that were hidden under the heavenly vault, the sky, which could only be found by the worthy, who would use such knowledge for the benefit of mankind. It struck us as noteworthy that the number of scrolls is almost exactly the number of days in a century. Hermes took over the mantle of Thoth as the inventor of writing, architecture, arithmetic, surveying, geometry, astronomy, medicine, and surgery. Both Thoth and Hermes were extremely important in the legends of Freemasonry, and the two names are treated in Masonic myth as representing the same person. Quote, in the tomb of Ozymandias were deposited 20,000 volumes, all of which, on account of their antiquity or the importance of their subjects, were ascribed to Thoth or Hermes, who, it is well known, united in his character the intelligence of a divinity with the patriotism of a faithful minister. End quote. The ancient charges of Freemasonry tell us how Hermes/Thoth was involved in the early development of science, as this quotation from the Inigo Jones version shows. This is a very long quoted, like more than a page here, so bear with me. Quote, You asked me how this science was invented. My answer is this, that before the general deluge, which is commonly called Noah's flood, there was a man called Lamech, as you may read in the 4th chapter of Genesis, who had 2 wives, the one called Adah, the other Zillah. By Adah he begat 2 sons, Jabal and Jubal. By Zillah he had 1 son called Tubal, and a daughter called Naamab. These 4 children found the beginning of all crafts in the world. Jabal found out geometry, and he divided flocks of sheep. He first built a house of stone and timber. His brother Jubal found the art of music. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. Tubal-Cain was the instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, and the daughter found out the art of weaving. These children knew well that God would take vengeance for sin either by fire or water, wherefore they wrote their sciences that they had found in 2 pillars, that they might be found after in 2 pillars, that they... I'm sorry. I looped my thing. Wherefore they wrote their sciences that they had found in 2 pillars, that they might be found after in 2 pillars, that they might be found after Noah's flood. One of the pillars was marble, for that will not burn with any fire, and the other stone was laternus, for that will not drown with any water. Our intent next is to tell you truly how and in what manner these stones were found whereon these sciences were written. The great Hermes, surnamed Trismegistus, or 3 times great, being both king, priest, and philosopher in Egypt, he found one of them, and lived in the year of the world 2076, in the reign of Ninus, and some think him to be grandson to Cush, which was grandson to Noah. He was the first that began to learn of astronomy, to admire the other wonders of nature. He proved that there was but one God, creator of all things. He divided the day into 12 hours. He is also thought to be the first who divided the zodiac into 12 signs. He was minister to Osiris, king of Egypt, and is said to have invented ordinary writing and hieroglyphics, the first laws of the Egyptians, and diverse sciences, and taught them unto other men. Anno Mundi. I'm a little rusty on my Roman numerals. What does D stand for? I don't remember. Is that 500? I don't remember what D is in Roman numerals. So it's MDCCCX. So M is 1,000. No, G is 500. C's are 100. X is 10. I don't remember what D stands for. If somebody knows, let me know. That's the end of the quote, also, by the way. Here, Freemasonry recalls how the Greeks built up their beliefs first from Egyptian legends. The dating Anno Mundi means from the beginning of the world, which is taken by Freemasonry to be the year 4000 BC. The time when the Sumerian civilization apparently materialized out of nowhere. Interestingly, the date given in the passage tells us that Thoth Hermes invented writing and taught the sciences to mankind in 3390 BC. As we now know, this was little more than 200 years before the consolidation of the first united kingdom of ancient Egypt took place, and the earliest known hieroglyphics were produced. In the 4th century BC, Jewish theology had become mature with detailed legends of its own, and the priesthood did not want any intrusion from the Greeks or anyone else. However, many of their people were quick to forget the most restrictive aspects of their covenant with Yahweh and took to this new cosmopolitan world order with great alacrity. Soon the new race, which called themselves Jews, spread, establishing their own quarter in just about every Hellenistic city. The Jews had few skills to offer, as their young culture had no heritage of building or manufacture, but through cruel circumstances they had learned to live on their wits and extract their best out of any situation. A natural resourcefulness and willingness to keep going in the face of adversity made them particularly suited to becoming traders, buyers, and sellers, wheelers and dealers, who could make a good, honest living by spotting an opportunity for profit that others might miss. Jews quickly became respected members of the new commerce that drove the Greek Empire. One commentator described them as Greek not only in speech but in spirit. The Jews took their belief in Yahweh with them, and their sacred books were translated into Koine. I don't know what that is. Koine. I've never seen that word before in my life. Koine, the contemporary city-based version of classical Greek. These writings became known as the Septuagint. I know I didn't pronounce that right. The Book of the 70. The early scriptures now existed in Hebrew, Aramaic, and of the Persian Empire and Koine Greek. And from this point on, new religious works could be read and even originated in any one of three languages. Language, however, is a strange thing. It is like a living, creative, and special means of communication that works within a community at a given point in time. Translation is an imprecise art and not the scientific replacement of one word with its exact counterpart that many people imagine. The Greek language was developed by a rational, free-thinking, cosmopolitan people who used oratory and philosophy to great effect. By contrast, Hebrew had been developed by an inspired, irrational people with a very different worldview. The Koine-speaking Jews of Alexandria, Ephesus, and other cities who translated their scriptures with good intent could not fail but to affect the flavor and import. The Jewish world outside of Judah was known as the diaspora, and the faithful minority back in Jerusalem were alarmed at what was happening in the new places beyond their borders. They came to call these diaspora Jews seekers after smooth things, or as we might express it today, the easy life. They wanted the heritage of their Jewish birth, but they sought the good things that living the Greek way brought. They interpreted the law as it suited them, and worst of all, they transgressed with the invention of the synagogue. Synagogue is not Hebrew at all. It is Greek, meaning bringing together, and it was originally a place for Jews to meet and organize their community needs in order to uphold the various laws, particularly their food laws. At some point, however, the synagogue turned from a meeting house into a temple, a place at which one could actually worship Yahweh. This was an outrageous idea to those who believed their God could only be worshipped in his house in Jerusalem. The devoted followers of God back in the Holy City were appalled at the growing slackness of the Jews, and they began to expect the worst. Yahweh would punish them horribly unless they got a lot holier. The religion of Yahweh was by now coming to the attention of occultists who were fascinated by the magical properties they saw in it and who took a very different view of its meaning. The numerological elements seized their attention, and even the Hebrew name of God, pronounced Yahweh but written as Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, took on special meaning. The Greeks called this name of God the Tetragrammaton, and treated the Jewish texts as a source of supposedly ancient esoteric wisdom. New cults arose in the Hellenistic Empire, basing themselves on the scriptures of Yahweh, yet not being themselves Jews. These Gentiles took what they wanted from Judaism, and it was these groups, as we shall see, who were the breeding ground for a later Greek mystery cult called Christianity. Conclusion. So we're on our last page. The temple that Solomon had built for Yahweh had incorporated one of the most important symbolic representations of the enduring strength of the revitalized Egyptian monarchy, the symbol of the two pillars, and we now knew that this symbol had a direct linkage to the exodus of Moses via Joshua, Gideon, Abimelech, and Samson. It seemed reasonable that if the more public aspects of the ritual of Sekhmenre had been handed down to the Israelites by Moses, then the more important king-making initiation ceremonies might also have survived. Once again, there was an historical oddity after the death of Solomon which attracted our attention. Whilst the northern kingdom of Israel was racked by changes in its ruling line, in the southern kingdom of Judah the line of David was uninterrupted for over 400 years. We came to view this stability as circumstantial evidence of the survival of the second Enre resurrection ritual, conferring a divine right to rule on the line of David. We had found evidence to support this position in the ritual reenactment by the king of the original battle of the triumph of the forces of light over the forces of darkness and chaos described in the Enuma Elish, which reminded us strongly of the Egyptian hippopotamus ritual. However, it was our detailed study of the Babylonian exile period of Jewish history which finally disclosed the explanation of how Sekhmenre's name was dropped. Ezekiel, the architect of the imaginary second temple of Yahweh, had told the exiled elders of Jerusalem to remove the Egyptian practices of their secret mysteries conducted in the darkness beneath the Temple of Solomon. We knew that to this day the ritual of Sekhmenre's resurrection is conducted in darkness, having both experienced it. We had been struck by the similarities to the earlier verse in Genesis 49:6, which is the only reference in the Bible to the killing of the Theban king. The book of Ezekiel goes on to tell how the prophet purged the children of Israel of their Egyptian practices and brought them back to the way of Yahweh. So now we knew how Sekhmenre Tau had become Hiram Abif, the king who was lost. It was the work of the brooding figure of Ezekiel in an attempt to explain the failure of God to sustain his own temple from his enemies. And that is the end of the chapter. So for next time, for Friday, that will take us to chapter 11, the Boaz and Jachin. I don't know, Jachin Peshur. I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce a lot of these words, so you'll just have to bear with me butchering them, or correct me in the chat. Let me know. So that is that for the night. I raided last night. I'm not going to raid tonight. I'm just going to call it. So thank you all for coming in. I will see you on Friday for the next at least one chapter, and I'll go through the pictures in the next session. They're kind of pertain to the entire book, so it's kind of hard to just pick them out. I'll just go through them all at once at some point, probably next time. But anyway, have a good night. Thank you again for coming in, and I will see you on Friday.
Feeling shattered skies, watching tears some peace of mind. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Assembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations.